Thank you, Pastor Margaret. I was just telling Pastor Chris, this talk is a full course. It's not just a 15, it's a full course. You can do it over a 3-month period, because working on Jay Kumar's framework, or Chris Wright's framework, or Brian Meyer's theological overview is in itself, because they're all different books and theories. But I think what we have been able to see is that the Bible and the work or the teachings of God, as revealed in the Old and the New Testament, is far more comprehensive to the sort of limiting our Christian understanding if we looked at the frameworks from the Bible, that God's concern is for the whole of creation and humanity, faith, salvation, but at the same time, other aspects are equally critical, and the Old Testament and the verses reveal that over the theological and biblical understanding. So thank you, Pastor Margaret, for that overview. And I think at this point, let me call Professor Ramy Bulan. Professor needs very little introduction because she has been here before giving the talks, but I came to know her well through the Suhakam work, because I think most of the Suhakam documents on land rights on Sarawak, actually she was involved, and I think her major work was the number of case studies that they did on the land inquiry report, concrete case studies, the legal framework, and the violation. So I thought it's important, and let's give Prof. Ramy Bulan a hand and pass the time to her.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennison and Pastor Chris and Pastor Margaret and members of this church who invited me to come and speak. Grateful to be part of a move in the house of God to look at issues of justice. When I first received this invitation, I looked at the title. It says, "Give them their land." And I thought, wow, we've been doing lots of conferences at the faculty over the years. I have run quite a number of conferences on this, but we put the titles as, we start with recent developments in native customary land rights, multiculturalism and the law. And we talked about indigenous knowledge, heritage, and preservation of indigenous heritage. And then we had another one on the UN Declaration, bridging the implementation gap. And the most recent one we had was on access to justice for indigenous peoples, integrated human rights approach. So we couch it in so many ways to try and put these issues on the table, and hoping that people, by sensitizing people to these needs, that there will be a response. I'm just looking at the time. You have to warn me. I don't have a watch. Yeah. Okay, so this title, to say, "Give them their lands," I think is very loaded, and it comes with almost a knowledge of what has gone before and that something needs to be done in the situation. Sorry, how do I? Yes.
Forward.
It's upside down. Okay. I think an understanding of indigenous rights, or their rights to land, we need to understand the whole context in terms of the historical factors that brought about the issues, why they are the way they are today. There needs to be an understanding of the history, colonization, alien laws that have been placed on the people, and resulting in vulnerability of communities. Now, much has already been said about this. I want to also look at the evolving judicial recognition of common law And the developments in this area as to what we see today in terms of development of common law and how that is helping indigenous peoples in their quest for getting back their lands, as it were, and the resurgence of customary laws couched in international human rights law. Again, the whole development in international human rights law has been something that the indigenous peoples the world over they've ridden on the crest of this. As someone says, if the tide rises, and every boat will rise with the tide. And we see also when we recognize indigenous rights, there is a section in international human rights law that deals with indigenous peoples, and because indigenous peoples' rights are recognized, it also raises the whole regime of international human rights law as well. So that's something for us to bear in mind. Who are indigenous peoples? We keep talking about indigenous peoples. The terms that are used for them are varied. In some places, they're called aborigines. The Orang Asli are termed as aborigines in our constitution. In Sarawak and Sabah, they're called natives. In other places, tribal peoples, hills people, pribumi, all these terms are used to describe indigenous peoples. But one thing that we do know is that they are indigenous because of their ancestral roots, very much embedded in the lands on which they live or in which they would like to live. And compared to the other societies or other communities that live alongside them, their roots are so much more embedded in the land. Their identity is so tied to the lands that they live in. And an indigenous person's psyche is very much tied to the land as well. It's so intertwined with the land. It's almost very cliched now to say, well, indigenous peoples, their identity is tied to the land. Sometimes it's almost brushed aside as just a cliche, but when you see where people have been placed, and I think there's also a verse in the Bible that says that God placed people in their own place, and I think indigenous peoples feel that so much more keenly. There are times when people also don't want to use this term because they say, well, this is a colonial, it's a colonial term. They come in here and they say, you are the indigenous people, we are people who come from elsewhere. There is also, on the one hand, indigenous peoples themselves are now pushing to say, we are the indigenous peoples. But there are some countries, of course, who will say, we don't have indigenous peoples. We all have been here. China refuses to use the word indigenous. We have minorities, not indigenous peoples. India says, we don't have indigenous peoples. We have scheduled tribes, but not indigenous peoples. Because the term comes with its own meanings. In Malaysia, now, I know this is, sometimes it's contested. Some people say Malays are not indigenous. Maybe as we go along, you will see really whether we should put Malays there as indigenous. But I think politically or in terms of policy, Malays are considered Bumiputra together with natives and Orang Asli. But of course, that's another thing altogether, that Bumiputra is really a political term. Some people tell me, why do you use the term natives? It's very pejorative. But that's how natives are described, and I think they're quite happy to be described as such, because that's who they are. Right, so this is where we are in Malaysia. Natives are determined by law, they are defined. You see in Sabah, I put there more than 38 groups that are listed. But if you sit down with them, they will say there are more than that. There are more than 58 groups and many subgroups. But what is a common thing with them is again, their connection to the land. There's been a lot of studies. I see some of my former students here. You would see that we talked about this. One of the studies that was done by the United Nations, one of the very first studies, and this has been referred to by many scholars or people who refer to indigenous peoples as a definition of indigenous peoples. And you see that they talk about pre-existence, meaning before the colonial powers came. They have a continuity on the land, occupy the ancestral land, they have a distinct culture and identity, and they self-determine, meaning self-ascription. They decide who falls into this group. More often than not, they are the non-dominant sector of the population, but that also definition does not fit in every country because, as you know, in terms of numbers, indigenous peoples are more in this country, but that doesn't mean that they hold the political reins altogether. So there is a shared global identity. Now, the reason why I want to stress this is because you put two indigenous persons together in a group, in a hall. They could be from Scandinavia, or they could be from America, from any part of the world. They can sit together and they share a common identity. They understand each other, almost like trans-border thing, you know, because their history has been one of a common history, special relationship with the territories in which they live. And I want to also say they don't really talk about land just as a piece of land, but a territory which is related to a communal right to the land. They talk about a communal identity. But generally, there has been a history of oppression and blatant inequalities, and as a result of colonization or industrialization. And you see a suppression of their cultural patterns and their indigenous governance. Pastor Margaret has already talked about that they did have, or they often have their own system of governance that has been disrupted in many ways. And many of these societies have gone through oppression, but they are still very resilient societies. In Australia, for example, they thought they will just die off. But you see, they still remain and they will come back, as it were. All right, so there are many factors that have gone against indigenous peoples again. From the early 20th centuries, they have been excluded. Policies of assimilation to take children from the communities and then, as it were, take the Aboriginal out of the child. But one of the greatest things that has been a source of oppression, I think, is the empire builders, Europeans coming in to explore, control, and utilize the lands, or you may put that as they came for gold, for God, gold, and glory. In many ways, of course, we have been the beneficiaries of people coming out to Christianize nations. But in some nations, it's been very brutal. We have, by the grace of God, we have not had that kind of brutality here, but some nations have had. And the gold, they came to utilize, to get the resources, and of course, to expand the empire. And this has brought dispossession in terms of the indigenous peoples, that the mind of the empire, of the imperial powers, was to take the undeveloped estates. And they say, we have a right to come, the right in God to take out these lands because they're not cultivating the land. We have the right to just come and cultivate this land or take over these lands. And we see this same principle going through not just the colonial time and into the present realities, where you see dispossession, as we have seen in the documentary just now. Relocations and dispossession of indigenous peoples have continued for many reasons to take the resources. Sometimes, not sometimes, very often in the name of development. And of course, their application of alien systems of laws. Now, I want to emphasize this a little bit later. as to how the law that has been placed on indigenous peoples have been a source of oppression for them. So vulnerable communities, many indigenous peoples have become very vulnerable, and I've already touched on encroaching commercial interest. Today, this has continued. As you can see, we talked about, the Suhakam inquiry. They have come up with a list of things that they have found on the ground, lands taken for plantation, given off for logging licenses, and for land development schemes and commercial land development schemes. Each of these, in a way, have affected indigenous communities. The Orang Asli, for example, during the emergency, there was a resettlement scheme. Take them out so that they can be protected. And by doing that, they have been disconnected from their lands. And today, when they try to prove their connection to the land, it's difficult because they have been moved out from their lands. And sometimes it's because of land development schemes. They have been moved out. And now they try to prove in court that they have customary title to the land, and it's difficult for them because their evidences have been taken away from them, as it were. And so I don't need to say more. We've looked at resettlement schemes and how these have affected. Now, how can, you can see then this repeat of history through modernization, development. It's not just something that came through colonization. How can we then roll back these historical inequities? As I said, we need to look at it in terms of an international movement. There is now an increased international sensitivity to oppression of indigenous peoples, and because of that, there's also been an increased international response to this, and using the language of morality to challenge the existing oppression, and the worldwide social movement where indigenous peoples themselves are the principal protagonists. Now, this is a good and a welcome change, but I must say that when we look at the international scene, it's the NGOs who have been the ones who have pushed the frontiers of justice. They have just taken it by the horn, and they've come to the United Nations and said, look, listen to what the indigenous peoples are saying. So one of the things that have come, and I want to go over this very quickly because we don't have time. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have been debated for more than 25 years. And it's only in 2007 we find that this declaration was passed, or rather accepted at the General Assembly. And Malaysia was a party to this. And so because we have signed this, I think there is an expectation that what is contained in the declaration should be observed as a minimum standard for the protection of indigenous peoples. And among the provisions there are that their lands should be protected, lands and resources, and that their unique cultures and traditions should also be protected because it is so intertwined with the land. Now, as I said earlier, by adopting the declaration, it's a major step to promotion of human rights as a whole. But let me just very quickly look at some of the provisions in the... Now, these are provisions in the UN declaration. I'll just make one point to say that there was only a need for declaration only because many of the rights in all the other documents, international human rights documents, were not really applied for indigenous peoples. So by this declaration, all it means is it's nothing new, no new rights, but bringing whatever was in the other documents into a specific document that says these are the rights of indigenous peoples. There's no new rights, really, nothing apart from their rights to the land, yeah? And where it is different is the collective rights that indigenous peoples, and this is one of the most contentious things in the declaration that they had to negotiate for, because they are a community and they want to live as a community. They don't want to be assimilated with the rest of the communities. All right, so these again are some of the main things that you see in the declaration. I wouldn't go through this except to say that the right to self-determination is one of the most important rights there. It basically just means let us have the right to decide for ourselves what happens to us, how we want to do our lands and so forth. And why is it so important to have that? Because for so many generations, centuries, that right has not been given to them. It's been taken away from them. So it was there's a need to put it there. Then, of course, Indigenous people's rights to lands, and that it is a collective right. And one of the other rights is that pre, prior, and informed consent. This is another one again. Would governments actually listen to Indigenous peoples and say, ask us before you do anything with our lands? And this is one of the most contentious issues, I think, because governments will say, the land belongs to the state. Why should we consult you before we do anything on the land? But the declaration, this is has emphasized this because for many, many generations or many centuries, there is no consultation. They just find that they have been roughshod over. Okay, so in a way, the declaration is a remedial document to try and remedy that. So I'll go very quickly over this. These are some of the provisions that are in the declaration. Article 25 to right up to 28, you see that that right to their lands is not just a right to property that they have used, but lands that they have occupied, traditionally occupied, or acquired. So all that is not lands that they have documents for, but what they have traditionally lived on. Okay, so that's just how do we implement this? How do we implement this? I just very quickly come to, if you give me 2 more minutes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Some people say, well, declaration is not law, and so why should we bother about it? I want to just show how we have a very good framework with which to address Indigenous people's rights, I think. Because the definition of law in Malaysia is a written law, common law, and custom and usage having the force of law. And I think it's only in Indigenous land rights you see the interplay of this law, where we have written law. There are provisions for land rights in written law, and I want to talk about the common law and customs in a while. But these are the sources of the rights of Indigenous peoples to their land. Legislation, unfortunately, is very, very restrictive, and that is one of the problems why we have problems with the lands today. For example, the Sarawak Land Code says all lands belong to the state. All lands without documentary title belongs to the state. So what does that mean? All lands belonging to Indigenous peoples, they don't have documentary title, it belongs to the state. And they have to prove that they have customary rights to the land. And it's a very expensive thing, as you have seen, coming to the courts to be able to prove that. The Orang Asli Aboriginal Peoples Act basically says Orang Asli are tenants at will. They don't have any rights to the land. They are there until such time the owner of the land says, get out, you are only a tenant. So that is what we have in the law. But common law by common law I mean laws that are made by the courts or through the courts. That is the one I think that has been for Indigenous peoples equality, to give them, to respect existing rights. And the courts, I think, have been the ones who have pushed this. Now, if we, in Malaysia, we may say the courts are there are a lot of things thrown at the judiciary, but this is one area, I think, where the judiciary has been the activist. They have looked at this and they have pushed the frontiers of the law based on what is done in the other countries, following what is done in the, I call it Kanzo states, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US. Those laws in the common law jurisdictions have been taken by our courts to push the rights of indigenous peoples, and they've given them unprecedented legal coverage. And as the academia picked this up, this has helped also so that it will be applied in the courts. And it's good to see that our courts now beginning also to pick up those things. And I must say that when the courts began to pick this up, they made modern history, and they're still making modern history because they are now beginning to say something that was not there before. Now, for example, here, they say that common law recognition basically states that they go on to say, indigenous peoples are not just users of the land. They have a property right to the land. Never mind that they do not have documentary title. This is something that the courts have said. No, it didn't come from written law, but the courts have said that. And they call for strengthening of the legal protection of indigenous rights, and they call for restitution of lands taken by colorable means. And this is something that has gone through the courts. And in a way, as I said, that this is one of the most, it really shook, I think, the political system as such. Suddenly now they have to deal with this. All right, so you have many common law decisions from Australia and from, this is a Canadian position, which our courts have taken. And you see many decisions that gone through the courts are very similar to what is done in other nations, and it's gone up to the federal court in this case, and recognizing that these rights are not given by law, but it's not created by statute. It is a pre-existing right. Now, I think this is very revolutionary because states always like to look at just written law. What does it say about written law? Particularly in Malaysia, we are very, very, bound by provisions in the law. And here one situation where you see the court saying it was a pre-existing right. And those land lawyers here are talking about adverse possession. I don't know where this falls within that, because we are talking about pre-existing right here. Yeah, so common law says, yes, the state will have a radical title, but it is encumbered by native rights. I think that is something that's very revolutionary. Now, the problem that we have is very much today, is very much, while the courts have said this, these are the things that they have, that indigenous peoples have to prove in the courts before they can claim any rights. And the courts have said there is a coexistence of the statutory rights with customary title, but having all this recognition, and my time is up. I'll just finish off with this last two. What has all this done for indigenous peoples? So you have now a very good international movement, and you have all these decisions in the court. Has it brought much benefit to indigenous peoples? I think one of the problems that we have is there is still a lot of problem with how much of the customs of the people we need to recognize in order to give them their rights. We see non-implementation of court decisions on customary tenure, there's limited recognition of Orang Asli customary territories, and I think maybe Amy will talk about this later on. This is the problem that we have. Even though the courts have said this, there's lack of recognition of their customary territories. And so there needs to be a full recognition of customary land tenure if we are going to see and to restore justice to indigenous peoples. There is a need for equal treatment and non-discrimination of the laws that govern them. And until such time, you will still see the same problem that we are seeing now. All right, so if there is unequal society, elites will find it easier to capture governments and other institutions. So we need to see some equality in this. I think I will stop here and just say that any recognition, any real recognition must take into account the indigenous perspective and their own conceptions of property ownership. Otherwise, you will find that we will still have a law that could still be oppressive. Thank you very much.